Transferring wealth successfully starts with asking yourself questions that will give your family a better life now and for generations to come. In this podcast, financial professionals John and Michael from Copper Beech Financial Group guide you through eye-opening questions to help you discover the truth about your wealth. Now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to The Truth About Wealth with John and Michael Parise of Copper Beech Financial Group. Well, we have Michael and we have Chris Ruffino here today, standing in for John, who is traveling as usual. Right,
Yes.
Michael?
Yes, he tends to be. It's not because he doesn't like recording these podcasts. It's just that he's a very busy man, even at his ripe old age. But I know I'm gonna get yelled at.
I actually think he would want to be recording the podcast as opposed to traveling.
I
really do.
Yes, he very much enjoys this. But we're very happy to have Chris with us here today. Thanks again, there, Chris, for being a part and filling in. Hopefully, we'll be doing more of these in the future, or maybe with all three of us in the same room. That'll be nice.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to be here. It's great to be on the podcast, and I don't think I can ever replace John, but I'm happy to be on it. So,
all right. So we're going to talk today. When Chris and I were talking about kind of topics to discuss, we both thought that having a topic, we've talked a lot. My father and I have talked a lot on the podcast about estate planning and the importance of that, and we've touched on estate planning for younger people. But I think that when Chris and I were talking today, we both thought that we haven't really had an episode, let's say, dedicated to that. And you know, there's a lot of listeners that are younger, starting families, and maybe don't have an estate plan in place. They should have one in place. So we wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that today. Chris is going to have a lot of input in addition to myself here, but that's what we're going to talk about.
yeah, I absolutely. Joining Copper Beech, we've just are very estate focused, and it's really a lot. But for, clients across the wealth spectrum that might be a bit younger, why is it important for them to be thinking about estate planning in, let's say their 30s?
Yeah. So let's get into, well, particularly if I always say with younger families that we're working with, if they have a child, let's say you're married and you have a child, the most important thing, the reason why you should have an estate plan is guardianship. And what a lot of people maybe don't know is that if something happens to you and your spouse and you have children and they're under the age of being an adult, you need to have somebody that gets appointed to raise them until they reach adulthood. And if you do not spell that out within your will and have that really laid out clearly, it basically reverts back to the courts making those decisions. And oftentimes that's probably not a very good result. You have maybe in-laws from either side of the family that have to come in there. Maybe one side of the family is arguing they should be able to take over that guardianship and the other side's arguing. And so it can create a fairly messy situation. And so the most important thing is that guardianship issue, because that should be very clearly spelled out in your will. So I know when we were talking, about some families we're working with that are younger, that was a pretty common theme that we saw. And we wanted to kind of relay that here as well. So
Sure. Yeah, besides that guardianship, though, if I'm just starting a family, have a child, what else do I need to do for estate planning?
Well, I think that we talk a lot about trusts. That's a big one. Asset protection is a theme that we've talked a lot about on this podcast. Challenge with younger families. I went through this with my own documents in terms of when my wife and I were doing our documents after we had our first daughter. Well, we actually did ours before we had kids, so we'll get into that in a second. But when we had kids and we had to go through that guardianship conversation, we started talking about how we wanted to have our assets, be left for our kids. And the challenge for younger families is, when your kids are so young, you don't really know how they're going to be when, they turn 18, as an example, or become an adult. And again, God forbid you pass away early in your life when you have younger children, you're not going to be here to be able to guide them through that process. And so asset protection of your assets becomes, I think, more important from a different perspective than perhaps many of our listeners have gathered from prior podcasts. Because a lot of times we're talking about working with families that have a lot of financial capital, a lot of assets, and asset protection is still very important there, but for a different reason. With this conversation, you might just be starting out. You might not have really accumulated a lot of that financial capital. However, you're still in a situation where your children might not be capable of handling those funds when they turn 18. So that's where trusts come in, because you can leave your assets in trust for your children that when they reach the age of majority, there's still a trustee appointed to make sure that those assets are properly managed for them until such time as perhaps they reach a certain age, or if you've listened to prior podcasts, maybe the trust never ends. That's actually how our trust works right now, is that the trustee that we've appointed has full discretion to keep assets in trust or to make distributions. But the idea is we are not sure who our kids are going to turn out to be. We think they're going to turn out to be great kids, but if God forbid something happens to us, we at least have that protection in place.
Right. So Michael, you're talking about trust distribution rules, right?
Yep.
So, I created this wealth. I want to give it to my children. Maybe they're too young to handle it. And I want to put rules around how they can access this wealth. I kind of want to take a step back though, too, which one of the things that I've learned, being here at Copper Beach is that we want to begin to have a foundation to create wealth. And I believe that a trust is that foundation, right? It gives you an organization and a vehicle to be able to create wealth to be able to pass it to the next generation and sometimes beyond. So what are your thoughts kind of around that?
Well, yeah. I mean, we often talk about using trusts as an estate bank is the term that we've used quite a bit on the podcast. And I don't know if this is exactly where you were going, but I think a similar theme is that these vehicles, trust vehicles, can become we like to call it a box, really, where assets are held and owned, but it's a management tool first and foremost as well, because this trustee term is the term that I used a little bit earlier. The trustee is the person or party that you appoint to manage the assets that are held in the trust. They have a legal fiduciary responsibility to enforce the terms of whatever trust that you put in place for you. In this case, we're talking about your kids. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes a really centralized, again, box to be able to handle all of that, and maybe has a professional manager or somebody that has a little bit more financial acumen to be able to help your kids as they mature and as they grow.
Mm-hmm. And we talk a lot about, wealth being created and lost across generations. The shirt sleeves proverb, right? Meaning, one generation creates the wealth, the second generation kind of spends the wealth, and the third generation is left without any wealth and has to recreate it, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the, I'm going to say like liabilities, but what are some of, the protection aspects that a trust can help a family, begin to create wealth and distribute it?
Well, again, the trust, when you go through this process and you create a will or a trust, you're going to lay out, part of the help the attorney will guide you through, or we will help guide you through if you're working with us, is to be able to outline what the terms of that trust say. And you're going to decide what you want to have happen. It's really your plan. It's not our plan. It's going to be your plan and how what your philosophy is around how you want these assets to be managed for your children. And so you can be more restrictive for that, and restrictive in a good way, or you could be less restrictive. And so you're going to set the parameters around how you can do that, or how those assets are used for your kids. So when they turn age 18, as an example, and they want to go to college, you can have specific provisions in that document about how those assets should be used to help that higher education goal that your children have, right? Or maybe they want to start a business somewhere when they get a little bit older. You can lay all of that out, and if you're even going to combine it with some of the legacy letter stuff that we've talked about too. I mean, all of these different documents play a really key role, but that's how trusts really operate, is to, again, set parameters and set guidelines that you decide on about how you want your assets managed for future generations. Because to your point, this shirt sleeves proverb, is something that's happened really throughout all history in all different cultures. And it's not to say that trusts are or not having a trust is the main reason why that happens, but it's a contributing factor for sure, because there's not enough asset protection perhaps for the next generation in terms of being able to manage those assets effectively.
Yeah. So we're talking a little bit about distribution, but, give me an example of, and I just hear the word throughout my career, probate, right? And then I always think probate equals public, right? Yep. So how can, a trust or a will and a trust, right, help, a family keep things private?
Yeah. And that's I think we had a whole podcast. It's been a few years probably since we recorded that podcast. I think it's called, Is Your Estate Plan Public or Private? And it's a good refresher here, because trusts are a private type of document. And what the probate process that you alluded to, Chris, is when somebody passes away, the terms of their will, and they only have a will. And I think most people understand what a will is in terms of being able to lay out how you want your assets to be distributed. But they're funny legal documents in that they don't actually become legally effective until you die. So you can create as many wills as you want. Really, there's different states have different formalities you got to follow, but generally speaking, you can rip up a will at any point in time and redo a new one, because it hasn't actually become legally effective yet until you die. But because you're not here to be able to enforce the terms of that will, there are probate courts in every county in the country that are basically set aside to make sure that the terms of your will are enforced, because you're not here to enforce them yourself. And that process is public. So anybody can go down to the courthouse and see, what your value of your estate was, how you left assets to various children. Maybe you wanted to disinherit a child. That does come up. And if that was something that you wanted to do, that disinherited child now has the ability to go down to the courthouse and be able to see that they were disinherited and maybe contest that will. So a trust document, in contrast to that, is private. So if you have assets owned in a trust before you pass away, that trust bypasses the probate process. So it's completely private. So that is, for a lot of the clients we work with, and since you've been here, we've already had a lot of conversations with some of the families that you're working with about that being an important component, because a lot of people aren't aware of that. So if you have just a will, and I will point out too, I'm getting a little technical here, a lot of people think that if they have if they have trust language within their will, that's called a testamentary trust. That doesn't actually avoid probate. You have to have a standalone, either revocable living trust or an irrevocable trust, but you have to have a standalone document in order to avoid probate. And you have to have assets owned in that trust when you pass away in order to avoid probate. So again, talk to your legal advisors about this, make sure that you've got hopefully everything set up properly. But that was a kind of a long-winded answer to your question there, Chris, but that's hopefully was a good answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, privacy is so important. Just think about the spam phone calls that you get, the spam emails that you get. Think about what information that you would be putting out there, if you were to pass away, in your will, what assets you might own. Whatever you own is going to go to a court, and the court's going to decide where it goes, but it's also going to become private of who's going to get it, right? So think about, I don't know about you, but like half of my family has had their Facebook accounts taken over, right? Like the information out there can be used as a weapon against you, and a trust is really a vehicle to protect, your information more than anything. And I think that's pretty critical in this day and age.
Yeah, I think that the other thing that comes up is our probate courts are they're called courts of equity, and that means courts of fairness. And they have a lot of latitude to be able to change your will. Now, they will go through every chance they can to be able to make sure that the terms of your will that you draft are enforced properly. But when you get into certain instances of like people contesting the will, or maybe you have a will that was drafted 20 years before you pass away, and then the new will maybe wasn't done properly. You create these situations where there's a lot of gray area that a probate court is trying to figure out how to get to the quote unquote right answer. That's when you have a will contest. Now you've got two people that are contesting this will, saying probably very different things, and the courts are trying to figure out how to do that. They have wide latitude to make decisions. So I've had extended family members that have not had things set up properly, and the courts have come in and invalidated a will because, a child from a previous marriage came in and contested the new will, which they argued was, maybe done under undue influence or some other situation or duress, or, there's a whole host of reasons why they can try to challenge a will. The whole idea here, your question, Chris, is that if you create a trust when you're alive and you put assets in that trust while you're alive, it becomes private, and it's much harder for somebody to claim that you didn't mean what you did, because you did it while you were alive. You actually transferred title. You went through the process of creating it. And so it's a lot harder for somebody, because it's private and because you did it while you were alive, to challenge it. So that's, again, from an asset protection, from a privacy standpoint, these vehicles, regardless of your, let's say, your net worth across the wealth spectrum, they can provide value. So a lot of people think that they don't qualify for a trust. That's not true. Anybody can have one.
Sure. Yeah. So I always hear about protection from in-laws and outlaws. So we just talked a little bit about outlaws, and you touched a little bit at the end there on in-laws, but I think that's the most common situation, is child from a previous marriage, divorces in the future. That, I don't want to say it's the most common situation, but one of the situations where there's protection. If you can give like an example around, a trust kind of protecting the distribution of assets, if a son or a child was to get remarried.
Yeah, that happens. It comes up all the time in our conversations. But when you just keep in mind, when you leave assets to a child, and I think this, again, takes on a different context when we're working with younger families, because, again, their children are so young, they don't know if they're even going to get married. And so, again, kind of keep that theme in the back of your head as we're talking here. But if you leave assets to a child outright, let's forget trusts for a second. You leave assets outright to them. Most states, New Jersey, where we are, has this law where an inheritance is excluded from a divorce decree. So if you left assets to your child and your child is married and then they have a marital separation, most states, as I said, will exclude those inherited assets from that divorce decree. The challenge comes in is if you commingle those assets together. That's the risk here that we're talking about, is if you leave, I have two daughters. If I leave assets directly outright to my daughters, and they take that inherited asset and they put it in a joint checking account with their spouse, or they use those funds to buy a vacation house together, right? And the title of the house is owned jointly. That's where you've now commingled those assets together. If there was then a marital separation, that's going to be a part of the divorce decree. So where trusts provide value is, instead of making those distributions outright to that child, you leave it in trust for their benefit, and then you don't run the risk of that situation never happening. Some families will say this, well, I just make sure that I keep it in my own checking account, right? And yeah, if you keep it in your own checking account, you never ever commingle it, then perhaps that's okay. But again, that's hard to do over a lifetime of a marriage. Sure. It's what sometimes we would counsel clients is you can avoid that risk entirely by leaving an asset in trust for their benefit. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. There's one other thing that I hear around here a lot, is that we say our clients are stuck in the middle. And what we mean by that from a general sense at Copper Beech is that they have many different advisors, and, might be one on, a tax side, one on an estate side, an attorney there, an investment side, an insurance side. And, there's not a cohesive plan. But I think, our generation really has another stuck in the middle. We're stuck in the middle between providing and raising our children. And, we're stuck in the middle sandwich generation where, our parents are getting older and they're having some challenges too, when it comes to, whether it be their health, things like long-term care, the need for skilled nursing facilities. Can you touch a little bit on, how trusts might, work in that situation?
Sure. I mean, this is, I think, the full discussion of that topic, which is a great one. I'm glad you brought that up. It's probably beyond today's conversation, but I think it is important because we're kind of talking about younger families, like you mentioned, the sandwich generation. This is important, maybe not for themselves or their families or their downline generations, but for parents, it becomes really important. Is you mentioned long-term care, is irrevocable trust can play a really key role in protecting assets for upline generations, maybe for parents that might need long-term care in the future, or they might need to go into a nursing facility. And as many people know, there are a lot of, those are very expensive, and there's a lot of ways in which these facilities have structured how they end up getting paid for, for allowing a parent to be, to stay there. Mm-hmm. And so irrevocable trust, if you plan ahead of time, and that's a key component here, is starting early. And if you've listened to our podcast for a while, that's a general theme with planning, is probably start as soon as you can, because the sooner you start, the more time you have on your side to be able to do a lot of this. But if you can place assets in certain irrevocable trust vehicles, they could be asset protected from that scenario of a long-term care need in the future. A lot of elder law planning that gets done is about trying to make sure that assets are protected from government entities that are providing governmental assistance. Maybe that's a Medicaid discussion, and there are very strict rules around how you can qualify for Medicaid, and making sure that that's done ahead of time there are attorneys that we work with that's 90% of what they do as their career, because again, we're, the baby boomer generation's getting older. There's now a lot more discussions around that topic. So I think that's a really important one, but that's at a very high level, how you can start considering using trust for that need.
Sure. Yeah. Next generation families that we work with are definitely experiencing this, complex situation. Where do they start? Where do they begin? How do they, sort out how we're going to help mom? Right. And, that's something that Copper Beech, can help with, right? We want to make sure you're not stuck in the middle. We want to be able to, coordinate with all of your advisors and put together, a comprehensive plan for you to grow assets tax efficiently and, pass assets with governance. And, that's really a part of that.
Yeah.
So,
And I think that, we're talking about estate planning for younger families, but I'm going to go maybe in a different direction that we talked about in terms of, looking at the estate planning that your parents have done. We kind of talked about irrevocable trust for elder law planning in terms of maybe protecting assets from governmental entity, or if we need a long-term care situation. But, a lot of times, this is why we do family meetings with a lot of our families, is because very often people in our situation, and I'll throw us into that bucket, we're younger families, younger kids, we're trying to save for college, trying to do those types of conversations. And oftentimes we're not aware of what our parents maybe have set up for us in terms of their planning. And that's a really important component too. So, sometimes the planning that you do for your family could be influenced by some of the planning that your parents have done too. And so that generational coordination is really important as well. That's again, another, maybe a full topic for another day, but that just popped into my head. I think that's an important thing to consider too. If you're doing your planning, consider what your parents have done for you too.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think it's big for the, families in our generation to have a conversation with their parents and really ask them the question, how do you want to be remembered? Right? Do you want to be remembered in leaving, I don't want to say a mess, but, a problem that like our generation had to solve? Or, do you want to have a coherent plan and organized box of your wishes that, that your next generation can deal with, right? And understand and, you can have your feelings and thoughts through it cohesively in that plan. So
yeah, and that's you mentioned the shirt sleeves proverb earlier, and another reason why that exists, many believe, is because there was sometimes a failure to maybe coordinate the planning between the generations. Maybe the next generation wasn't prepared to inherit a lot of the complexity that mom and dad might have. They might have a lot of real estate, they might own a business, they have different account types. And so if you're somebody there you're trying to do planning for your family, and you're maybe concerned about what your parents have done for you or within their planning, maybe sit them down and talk about it, because it's important for you to your point, Chris, to kind of know what's going on, because that's just going to help, again, make that transition easier. And it's a traumatic event when a parent passes away in general, but you want to make sure that at least have a team around you that can help manage the financial complexity that sometimes comes along with that. And that's what we do, but it's also very integral to what maybe you're doing for your individual planning for your family. So, sure. And I love that. How do you want to be remembered quote? Because, it's our favorite question.
Yeah.
All the time.
Well, I mean, we've seen it. I mean, if John was here, when John's here, he can tell you lots of stories around, beginning to do some planning, but didn't, fully go through with it, or never did any planning. And, it left, this mess, right? Or paid undue taxes, or caused this stress, or, there's just numerous, bad situations they can come from doing it. So we want to do offensive planning. I mean, we want to do get it done now. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the sandwich generation, because that is, it's a lot for people our age to juggle, and between raising our own children and making sure that mom and dad are taken care of, whatever that might mean. And so it's a challenge to make sure that all that gets done right. And, there are resources obviously out there for people that are dealing with those situations to go to, Copper Beech being one of them, but there's a lot of other ones out there too, but hopefully we're your first choice.
Absolutely.
Nice to that.
So, Michael, how can people get in touch with you if they want to find out more information?
Sure. You can reach us on social media, LinkedIn. Copper Beech has a page. Chris, I know you have a page as well. So you can reach out to us on there. You can reach us on our website, www.cbfgllc.com. You can always call us on the phone, 856-988-8300.
Okay. Well, thank you, guys. And thank you for listening today. Please like, follow, and share this podcast. Until next time, I'm Wendy McConnell.
Thank you for listening to the Truth About Wealth podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Copper Beech Financial Group. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.
This material is for informational purposes only. Neither APFS nor its representatives provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. Please consult your own tax, legal, or accounting professional before making any decisions. Copper Beech is not affiliated with American Portfolios Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolios Advisors, Inc. Securities offered through American Portfolio Financial Services, Inc., a member of FINRA SIPC, investment advisory and financial planning services offered through American Portfolio Advisors, Inc., an SEC-registered investment advisor. These opinions are subject to change at any time without notice. Any comments or postings are provided for informational purposes only and do not constitute an offer or a recommendation to buy or sell securities or other financial instruments. Readers should conduct their own review and exercise judgment prior to investing. Investments are not guaranteed, involve risk, and may result in a loss of principal. Past performance does not guarantee future results. Investments are not suitable for all types of investors. Copper Beech is an unaffiliated entity of American Portfolios Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolios Advisors, Inc. Any opinion expressed in this forum is not the opinions of American Portfolio Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolio Advisors, Inc., and have not been reviewed by the firm for completeness or accuracy. American Portfolios and Copper Beech Financial Group are not affiliated with any other named business entities mentioned.